On April 15th, 2018, a 56-year-old woman named Yoshika Yasutake began dusting a piano inside of her family's very small and very clean home in the English village of Helmsley. Like she always did, after dusting the outside of this piano, Yoshika lifted up the lid and began individually dusting each of the piano keys. But as she did this, she was very careful not to press down accidentally on any of the keys and make a sound. That was the last thing she wanted to do. Every time Yoshika was in charge of cleaning the house, she always dreaded getting to the piano because she was so worried about making a sound. After Yoshika had finished dusting this piano, both outside and inside, she lowered the lid and then walked over to a bookcase right next to a window and began dusting each of the books. And as she did, she began to hear out the window the sounds of birds chirping and cars driving around and people chatting. And Yoshika, when she heard this, she stopped dusting for a moment and just looked out the window at the beautiful town, all the little stone cottages that lined the road. And as she looked out there and listened to the sounds of her village, Yoshika was struck with a sadness about all the things that she was missing out on. Once, Yoshika had been a world-class pianist. She had trained at the Royal College of Music, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, and she used to play packed symphony halls where sometimes in the audience would be literal members of the royal family. I mean, she was a really big deal. But Yoshika didn't play the piano anymore because her younger sister, Rina, had come back home. Now, as soon as Yoshika thought of Rina, she got angry and instinctively just turned and stared at Rina's closed bedroom door. And just for a moment, Yoshika wished that Rina had not come home. Because ever since Rina had come home, it was like all of Yoshika's family had decided that nothing else was important. Rina was the only thing that mattered. The Yasutake family consisted of Yoshika, as well as, of course, Rina, who was 49 years old, and they both had a brother who was 51 years old, and his name was Takahiro, and the three siblings' mother also lived with them, and she was 80 years old. As for their dad, he had passed away a few years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were both very impressive in their own ways. Yoshika had been this amazing pianist, and Takahiro was this amazing writer, but Rina was just on another level. Rina not only spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, and Japanese, but she also created her own dialect of Japanese with a complete system of grammar. Rina was also this unbelievable artist, and everybody wanted to buy her paintings, but Rina would never sell. Or if she did, it was quite rare, but that only created lots of hype around her artwork. It was like so valuable to get your hands on one of Rina's paintings. As a child, Rina had been awarded all these scholarships to all these prestigious private schools, and then after graduating high school, she was given a full-ride scholarship to the University of Cambridge, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so everybody assumed Rina was on track to become this world-famous artist. But there was something dark inside of Rina that no one could quite place. It only came out when she would have these sudden outbursts of anger, and people would see this side of her that just didn't line up with the rest of who she was. But these flashes of anger would often pass quickly, and so people kind of wrote it off as a byproduct of extreme genius. It was like her brain just sometimes couldn't quite handle how smart she was, and she would get mad and frustrated. But when Rina graduated from the University of Cambridge and came back home, she just was totally different. It was like something inside of her had snapped and stayed broken. A couple of days after Rina had come home, she had one of those sudden outbursts of anger, but Rina's anger never went away. She just stayed mad for days and days, and her family began asking her, like, what has gotten you so upset? But Rina refused to talk about it. And eventually, Rina just locked herself in her bedroom in the family home, and she would stay inside of there, refusing to talk to her family for weeks. And then when she did finally emerge after several weeks, it was clear Rina was just different. She basically refused to speak to anyone, family included, unless it was absolutely necessary, and she really never left the house or even her room unless it was totally necessary. And it would turn out this was not some post-college phase Rina was going through. This would become Rina's life. She basically became a total recluse inside of that bedroom for decades, to the point where the family's neighbors didn't even know Rina existed because she basically never came out of the house. Yoshika stopped staring at her sister's closed bedroom door and turned her attention back to the books on the shelf. She finished dusting them, and then after she was done cleaning the house. And so she put the duster down, and Yoshika very quietly tiptoed her way over to Rina's closed bedroom door, and very quietly she knocked. Rina hated loud noises, which is why Yoshika was no longer allowed to play the piano, because it was too loud for Rina. After Yoshika gave this light knock, she began counting in her head to 30, because Rina had told her, you do not come in right away. You knock and you wait 30 seconds at least, and then maybe I'll let you come inside. And so Yoshika, she's counting in her head, 1, 2, 3, she gets to 25, 26, 27, and then from inside the room, Rina would tell Yoshika, okay, you're allowed to enter. Yoshika very slowly reached down, she turned the knob and opened up her sister's bedroom door, and it revealed this totally dark room, this very small, cramped space. All the shades and blinds had been drawn, and Rina was sitting on her bed, completely silent. And Yoshika, she kept her head down, being very careful not to make eye contact with Rina. She didn't want to upset her. And Yoshika, she walked into the room, she made her way to the table, and she scooped up all of Rina's dirty dishes. And then Yoshika, she turned around and began walking out again, and as she did, she tried to take a quick glimpse at whatever Rina was working on in her bedroom, because Rina had told her family that she was working on this master work, but wouldn't really elaborate on it. And in order to work on this thing, she needed the room to be dark and the house to be silent, and she needed to focus exclusively on this master work, and the family needed to support her as she did this. But again, Rina just never really elaborated on what this master work was. She would just say that it was very special, and it would combine all the elements of her life, her spirit, her body, her soul. Even the family would be a part of building this master work. And when her family asked her, well, what do you mean? How can we support you in making this master work? Rina would just say, oh, you'll know when the time is right. Yoshika couldn't get a glimpse of the master work, and so she quickly turned her head back down to the ground and shuffled her way out of Rina's room and shut the door behind her. And then Yoshika, she went to the kitchen and she dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was totally clean to begin with, because one of Rina's rules was the house must always be immaculately clean, no dirty dish, no dust anywhere. I mean, it had to be perfect, spotless at all times, because that's the only way Rina could work on this master work. And so as Yoshika cleaned and dried off all of Rina's dishes and began putting them away, her brother Takahiro walked into the kitchen, and he would say to Yoshika that it was time for them to leave the house and go to the market and buy some supplies for Rina so she can continue to work on this master work. Yoshika was immediately totally annoyed that they had to go do this, because everything was all about Rina, but she kind of buried those feelings and told her brother, okay, sure, let's go. Takahiro was different than Yoshika in how he thought about their younger sister, Rina. Yoshika totally resented Rina because now that Rina was home, Yoshika basically had to give up her career as this amazing pianist in order to support Rina in this whole master work she was working on. But Takahiro, he was totally fine giving up his writing career to just focus on supporting Rina, because he really believed in Rina, and he thought that this master work she was building was going to be like the single greatest piece of art in the history of humankind. And so Takahiro felt proud to kind of be a part of it. Now, Takahiro, like the rest of his family, had no idea what this master work actually was, but Takahiro and Rina had a much better relationship than Yoshika and Rina, and so Rina would tell Takahiro the specific things that she needed in order to build this master work. And so that day, Rina had told Takahiro some things she needed, and so he and Yoshika were going to go out and get them. So Takahiro and Yoshika threw on their jackets and stepped outside, and as soon as they were out there, they both flipped their collars up and kind of concealed their faces and put their heads down, because they were very careful not to make eye contact with other people. This family was already very private, but with Rina, they had been instructed to be even more private and not even really interact with the outside world. And so basically, anytime they went out in public, they would kind of hide themselves. And so Yoshika and Takahiro, they made their way to the pharmacy, they ducked their way inside, and they would purchase a bottle of surgical spirits, which is sort of like a medical alcohol. And then after buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up, headed back outside, and they went to an old used bookstore, and they bought a book on palm reading, which is the art of studying the lines on your hands in order to tell someone's future. And when the brother and sister bought this book, even though the cashier was talking to them, they kept their heads down and didn't say a word to the cashier. And then after getting their book, the brother and sister hurried their way back home. And when they got there, the door was locked. But instead of pulling out a key and unlocking the door of their own home, the brother and sister knocked and they waited. And then at some point, their mother came to the door and they heard 4 locks turning. The door opened up, and then Yoshika and Takahiro walked inside, and they shut the door and then locked again the 4 deadbolts. Rina was adamant that no one in the family could carry around a key to the house. It was too dangerous because they could potentially lose the key in town, and then someone could come into their house and potentially see Rina's master work, and they couldn't have that happen. And so nobody had keys. They had to knock each time they came home. And the reason they had 4 locks on the door was, again, because Rina was very worried about somebody coming into this house and seeing what she was doing. Yoshika carried the bag with the supplies inside of it, the surgical spirits and the palm reading book, over to Rina's closed bedroom door. And instead of knocking, Yoshika just placed the bag right outside the door. She turned around and began walking away. And then as she did, she heard the sound of Rina's door opening just a crack. And Yoshika, she quickly turned around and she saw a tiny skinny arm reach out from behind the door. It grabbed the bag and then pulled the bag back into the room, and the door shut and locked. Three days later, on April 18th, 2018, Yoshika was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when she overheard her brother, Takahiro, chatting with Rina. Now, Takahiro and Rina were not facing each other in the same room talking. Rina was still in her bedroom, her door was closed, and Takahiro was outside of her bedroom, and he was just sitting on the ground with his back to the door, talking through the door to Rina. Now, this was not unusual, because unlike Yoshika and Rina, who did not have a good relationship, and who really didn't talk at all, Takahiro and Rina did have a good relationship, and they would do this fairly often. They would chat through the door for like hours at a time. And so for a minute, Yoshika kind of ignored her brother and sister chatting and focused again on her book. But at some point, she began hearing what her brother was saying, and it was just totally weird. And so she put her book down and just began listening to Takahiro. And what he was saying was, "How can you do that? That doesn't make any sense. How? Only your soul? How?" Yoshika sensed that her brother was confused and maybe upset about something, and so she couldn't help herself. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room and looked down at her brother to see if he would kind of give her some indication of what was going on. But when Takahiro looked up and saw Yoshika, he and Rina stopped talking, and Takahiro just shook his head, stood up, and walked away. After Takahiro was gone, Yoshika very quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door, and just out of curiosity, she pressed her ear up against the wood and tried to listen to see if she could maybe hear Rina and catch something she was saying that would begin to explain what she had just overheard. But all she heard was the sound of Rina slowly shuffling towards the back of her bedroom where her bed was, and then it was totally silent. And so Yoshika moved away from the door and went back into the kitchen, and she sat down to read again, but she couldn't focus on the book because it was like this wave of sadness was just coming over her. And the reason Yoshika was feeling this way is she was thinking about the fact that back in the day when she was a kid, her and Rina used to be as close as sisters could possibly be, and for much of their lives, they were very close. Even after Rina began this kind of reclusive lifestyle, they still, were friends. They interacted. But something happened in 2013, 5 years earlier, that totally severed their relationship for good. On that day, Rina had emerged from her bedroom, and Yoshika offered to read Rina's palm. This was something the two sisters did for each other periodically. It was like a way for them to bond. And so Rina held out her hand, and Yoshika took it, and she began tracing a long horizontal line across her palm. Now, Rina's hands were different than most people's hands. Rina had something called a simian line, which is a very rare thing on people's palms. It's like this long horizontal line that runs the length of your hand. In palm reading, a simian line can be either very good or very bad. It can indicate that the person is a visionary or a mystic, so that's the good side, or it can indicate that this person has a terrible disease or they're very aggressive, so that's the bad side. Rina knew she had the simian line, and she believed that it represented something good. She would say that she had a visionary soul. But on this particular day in 2013, the family had recently been banned from a local supermarket because Rena had actually gone to this market and gotten really upset with some staff members and totally lost her cool and screamed and yelled at them, and so they had been banned. And so Yoshika, thinking about this, she's looking at Rena's palm and she goes, "Oh, the simian line. Maybe this is why you were acting so aggressive at the supermarket. Maybe this means you're an aggressive person." But after Yoshika said this, Rena was so offended that she whipped her hand back and began screaming and yelling at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand the vision that I have. I'm going to show the world someday this vision, and you and those idiots down at the grocery store would never understand." And then Rena began beating and punching and kicking Yoshika, and Yoshika's screaming and trying to protect herself, and then Takahiro, the brother, had to run in and separate the two of them. Now, even though Rena was prone to these angry outbursts, this was the first time that she had lashed out physically, and so Rena's mother was concerned that Rena had some underlying condition that was causing her to lash out physically, and so she sent Rena to the doctor, and the doctor would say, there is no underlying condition that led to this. However, it seems pretty clear that Rena is having some kind of psychological breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. But Rena had totally rejected this, refused to get treatment, and blamed everything on Yoshika. And then after that, Rena really stopped leaving her bedroom. She left like once every couple of months before that, but now she basically stayed in there 24/7. And at the same time, Rena had added all these new rules that her family now needed to follow to allow Rena to be able to focus on her master work while she was in her bedroom. And that included no one having house keys and adding those 4 locks to the door. Also, the family was told to learn the new dialect of Japanese that Rena had created. This way, no one would ever understand what they were talking about. It would kind of protect them even more from the evils of the outside world. Also, Rena made sure her family got rid of all of their telephones, their TVs, and their computers. And so Yoshika would sit in the kitchen for a bit longer, thinking about how sad it was that she had lost this relationship with her sister, and, Yoshika had a lot of regret about what she had said about the simian line. But eventually, like always, Yoshika just kind of pushed her feelings for Rena down, and before long, Yoshika was back to reading her book. For the next several weeks, Yoshika would see her brother, Takahiro, sitting up against the door to Rena's bedroom more often than usual, having these kind of hushed conversations through the door with Rena. Also, Yoshika began to notice that Takahiro was now cooking all of Rena's meals. Normally, their mother was the one who cooked Rena's food, but now Takahiro seemed to have taken over that task entirely. As for Yoshika, because she was primarily in charge of being the one to constantly clean the house, that meant she was the one going into Rena's bedroom and collecting her dirty dishes. And as soon as Takahiro had begun being the cook for Rena, Yoshika began to notice that more and more food was being left on Rena's plates. Basically, Rena wasn't eating as much food as she normally did, and this started to worry Yoshika. Rena was already a very small person. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, barely 90 pounds, and Yoshika worried that, she really needs to eat. She's already so small, she can't afford to miss meals. And then one day in the middle of May, Yoshika went into Rena's bedroom and she saw all of her dishes were basically completely filled with the food she had been given. She basically had not touched them. And Yoshika, she really never actually spoke to Rena when she was in the bedroom. But this time she just couldn't help herself. And without even looking at Rena, Yoshika, she gathered up the plates full of food and she said, "Rena, you need to eat more of your food." Rena didn't say anything back, and Yoshika, she just quickly turned and walked out of the room. But after that interaction, Takahiro would tell Yoshika that Rena doesn't want you going in her room ever again. And so from now on, the dishes that you would normally collect, Rena will place them right outside of the door. That way, you don't have to go inside that room. Also, around the same time, Rena, who normally would only leave her bedroom to go use the bathroom, well, she began going to the bathroom exclusively at night when her family was asleep to avoid any interaction with them. And so by this point, Rena's interactions with her family were reduced to basically zero. By early August, Takahiro and Yoshika were being sent to the store more and more often by Rena to get more of these surgical spirits, the medical alcohol. Now, neither Takahiro nor Yoshika Yoshika had any idea what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they knew it was their duty to support her, and so they kept buying them. And what they would do is they would come back home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door, and he would tuck the bottle inside, and then Rina would take it, the door would shut, and then Rina would never give them her empty bottle. Basically, the bottle went in and it stayed inside. Then, on August 18th of 2018, Takahiro and Rina appeared to get in some kind of a fight. Yoshika was in the kitchen and she saw that Takahiro was sitting against the door of Rina's bedroom, and the two were having kind of a hushed conversation. And then at some point, Takahiro stood up and he turned around and faced the door and kind of yelled into it, "I told you your soul was not enough." And then Rina said something back to him, at which point Takahiro said, "No, please, please," as if he was kind of begging with Rina to change her mind. And then before Yoshika could come over and ask Takahiro what was going on, Takahiro just opened up Rina's bedroom door and walked inside, and suddenly the house went completely silent. Yoshika was too nervous to walk over and look inside of the room, and so she just stayed in the kitchen and listened. And for 15 minutes, it was absolute silence. And then Takahiro walked out of Rina's bedroom, shut the door behind him, and he looked very calm. And at this point, Yoshika looked over at him and said, "What's going on?" And Takahiro, he would just smile and tell Yoshika that Rina's masterwork is nearly completed. And then Takahiro asked Yoshika if she remembered when Rina had said, at some point her master work was going to require some direct help from the family. But she said, we'll know when the time is right for us to participate. And Yoshika would say, "Yes, I remember that." And Takahiro said, "Well, the time is now." Then Takahiro told Yoshika that they had to go to the store and get more surgical spirits. And so really without questioning him, Yoshika went with him. They went to the store and they would purchase 3 times the normal amount of surgical spirits that they normally would. And then when they got home, Takahiro alone would go into Rina's bedroom with these surgical spirits. He would shut the door behind him, and Yoshika just sat in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until Takahiro came out again, no longer carrying these surgical spirits. And he would come over to Yoshika and he would say, "Rina is ready to reconcile with you. She wants you to sit by the door and talk to her. And if you do that, you can be more involved in creating her masterwork." And at this news, Yoshika felt a mixture of frustration and relief. She had never thought it was fair that Rina had so completely cut her off after that 2013 Simian line joke she made while palm reading. Also, Rina had made Yoshika's life so difficult for so long. I mean, Yoshika had basically been forced to give up her dreams of playing the piano, and she had to give up her friends and all of her life ambitions and goals to just support Rina. But despite all of that, deep down, Yoshika missed Rina terribly. They did used to be so close. She wanted to have that relationship again. And so Yoshika walked over to Rina's closed bedroom door. She sat down against it, and at first, she didn't say anything, and Rina didn't say anything either. But then at some point, it was like the floodgates just opened, and Yoshika kind of began pouring her heart out about how sad she was, about how her and Rina's relationship had really gone south and how she wanted to fix it. And now normally, on the rare times that Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it up to drop something off or whatever it was, oftentimes Rina would just start banging on something inside of the room, kind of to tell Yoshika to stop talking and go away. But as Yoshika sat there pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, the one thing Yoshika noticed was there was no pounding coming from inside the room. Rina was listening to her. And then the next day, after Yoshika and Takahiro had gone to the store again and gotten more surgical spirits and brought them back to the house, instead of just Takahiro being allowed to enter Rina's bedroom, this time Yoshika was allowed to join. And so Takahiro and Yoshika, they went into the dark bedroom, and Rina was laying on the bed, and they walked over to her, and Takahiro showed Yoshika what they needed to do. It was the last step of this masterwork project that Rina was working on. They basically needed to rub these surgical spirits all over Rina's body. Now, Yoshika didn't really understand why they were doing this, but she respected that this was part of Rina's plan, and frankly, Yoshika was just happy to be included in creating this master work, and so she didn't really ask any questions. And so after the brother and sister had rubbed this alcohol all over Rina for about 10 minutes, they walked back outside, they shut the door, and then Yoshika, she stayed back and sat down against the door and kind of poured her heart out again to Rina. And it was just very therapeutic. And in many ways, this was the first time that Yoshika was feeling happy again. I mean, she was finally starting to repair this relationship with Rina. And so over the next several weeks, this became Yoshika's new daily routine. Her and her brother would get all these surgical spirits, they'd come home, they'd rub them all over Rina, and then over the course of the day, Yoshika would stop by the door and chat with Rina through it, and that was it. And then on September 25th, 2018, after Yoshika and Takahiro had applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body, Yoshika told Rina that she had a very special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a really good mood this day because, one, she was feeling really good about her new relationship with her sister, but also, two, when she had gone to the pharmacy earlier with her brother, normally they didn't have any interaction with the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits, mostly because Yoshika and her brother did their best to kind of like hide themselves and make it very clear they were not looking to talk. But on this particular day, the pharmacist had been very talkative and was trying to talk to Yoshika, and Yoshika, she decided she would talk back. Now, their conversation was not very substantive. Basically, the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, why are you buying all these surgical spirits? And Yoshika would say, oh, they're for my sister Rina, and, she needs more and more of them every day, and, she's working on something special, and we don't really know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know whatever she's doing, it's going to be worth it. And so even though this conversation seems kind of meaningless, for Yoshika, who had virtually no contact with other people, it was great having that little talk. And so when she came home, she just felt ready to do something special for Rina. And so after Yoshika and Takahiro had left Rina's bedroom after applying these surgical spirits, Yoshika went to go give Rina her surprise. And so Yoshika, she walked over to the family piano that was not far from Rina's bedroom door. And Yoshika, she was nervous, but she sat down on the bench and she opened up the lid and she placed her fingers on the keys. Yoshika's big surprise was she was going to play a song called The Waltz of the Flowers, which is a famous piece of classical music that was inspired by the composer's love for his sister. And so Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to finally play in this house for Rina. She'll see that I love her so much. And so Yoshika, she began to play the song, and as she did, she was constantly listening to see if Rina would start banging on something to tell Yoshika to stop. But again, she didn't. It was quiet. And so Yoshika, she played this beautiful song. And then when it was all over, again, Yoshika's listening carefully for Rina to yell out or be mad that she's playing this loud music in the house. But it was just quiet. And so again, Yoshika just felt this closeness to her sister. And before long, Yoshika felt tears of happiness coming down her cheeks. But then, as Yoshika closed the lid of the piano, she did hear a banging, but it wasn't coming from Rina's bedroom. It was coming from the front door. And then a moment later, Yoshika heard someone scream from outside the front door, "Police, open up!" But before Yoshika could go to the door to open it, her mother had ran to the door. She opened all 4 locks, but then only opened it a crack and tried to yell at the police to go away, go away. But the police, they were kind of pushing on the door, trying to get the mother to get out of the way. And Yoshika, she kind of moved over and looked through the crack, and she saw it wasn't just a couple of police officers. It was a whole army of police officers and firefighters and EMTs. There was an ambulance. And then before long, the police officer that had been yelling, open up, he finally just pushed and got the door open all the way. And then a swarm of people in uniforms flooded the home. And as soon as all these officers were in the house, they immediately began opening up every door like they were looking for something. And then finally they got to Rina's bedroom and they opened the door. And as soon as they did, Yoshika watched as the officers just stopped at the doorway and they began cussing and yelling and turning their faces away. And then the officers went into Rina's bedroom. And then a minute later, they began talking on their radio. And then EMTs came into the house with a stretcher. They went into Rina's bedroom. And then before long, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched as the stretcher came out again with these officers and EMTs, and on the stretcher was Rina, and she looked terrible. Her eyes were sunken back in her head, and her skin was so pale it was practically see-through. I mean, really, she just kind of looked like a skeleton. The real story of what happened inside of that family's home would quickly become international news, and not because Rina was secretly creating a masterwork of art in her bedroom. Here's what really happened. Rena stopped eating food in April of 2018. She would say that the only thing she needed to be nourished was her visionary soul. And so basically, because she had this visionary soul, she didn't need food. That was the conversation that Yoshika had overheard between Takahiro and Rena when Takahiro was saying, "Only your soul? How? Well, he was trying to figure out how Rena was going to survive by being nourished by her soul. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward 4 months to August 18th, and again, Yoshika had overheard her brother and her sister talking through the bedroom door, except on this day, it sounded like Takahiro was fighting with Rena, because at some point he had stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul wasn't enough!" And then he had busted inside of Rena's bedroom and stayed in there in silence for 15 minutes, only to come back out again and very calmly tell Yoshika that, "Don't worry, Rena is nearing the end of her master work, and we just need to go out and get her more surgical spirits." Well, it would turn out the reason Takahiro was mad and yelled through the door at Rena is because he was trying to talk to her through the door and she wasn't talking back. And he suspected it was because she wasn't eating, and so he had yelled at her about that and then barged into her room only to find Rena totally unresponsive, not moving, not talking, nothing. And so he just stood there wondering what to do. And so as Takahiro is standing there, it clicks for him that now is the time. Now's the time to get involved. And so Takahiro left the bedroom, he grabbed Yoshika, they went to the pharmacy, they got more surgical spirits, they came back, and Takahiro alone went into Rena's bedroom and covered her head to toe in these spirits, because that was something she had wanted him to do before, and he believed that that's what she needed right now, because she can't talk, she can't move, she needs more of these spirits. That's going to help her visionary soul nourish her while she completes this master work. And for the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika would continue to apply these spirits to Rena's body, believing they were helping her complete her master work. On September 25th, when Yoshika and Takahiro were at the pharmacy getting more spirits, the reason this pharmacist finally struck up a conversation with Yoshika is because over time, the pharmacist had noticed that every time they came in to buy these surgical spirits, they smelled so bad. And on this particular day, when they came in, the stench was just overwhelming. And so the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, what are these surgical spirits for? And Yoshika would give this totally weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on this master work in her bedroom and it was all going to be worth it. And so when Yoshika and Takahiro had left that day, the pharmacist was just so weirded out and alarmed by them that he called the police. And when the police arrived at the family's home, they discovered that Rena was not building a masterwork in her bedroom, she was just dead in her bed, and had been for 6 weeks. Rena died around August 18th, which is the day that Takahiro came into the room and discovered her unresponsive, which meant there was never any reconciliation happening between Yoshika and Rena. It's unclear why Takahiro had told Yoshika, hey, Rena's ready to reconcile with you, because again, Rena was dead at the time, so there's no way she would have said anything to him. And so when Yoshika was having these supposed heart-to-hearts through the door with her sister or playing music for her, that wasn't real. The only real thing that was happening is Yoshika and Takahiro, from August 18th until the end of September when the police busted into their home, they would spend nearly every day rubbing this weird medical alcohol all over their dead sister's body because that's what they believed she wanted, when in reality, all this alcohol was doing was actually mummifying her body. Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother were all charged with preventing a proper and decent burial. As for Rena, her cause of death could not actually be determined, but based on what she looked like, they assumed she died from starvation. The court would eventually drop the charges against the family, saying that basically the family was too mentally ill to stand trial. And this was because the court had discovered that Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother actually had not accepted that Rena was dead. They believed she was actually still alive, that all the work they had done rubbing those spirits on her had nourished her soul, and she was still working on this master work. And as of a few years ago, the family is still living in that same cottage, and it's not clear if they ever actually came to understand that Rena was in fact dead. At around 9 p.m. on Saturday, October 15th, 1988, a 33-year-old woman named Cheryl Petrie grabbed a candy bar off the rack inside of PJ's Market. PJ's Market was a little convenience store in the city of Port Orchard, Washington, and it was where Cheryl worked. She was the cashier. And without ringing this candy bar up, Cheryl simply handed it across the counter to a female college student who had just come into the store to talk to Cheryl. This student had temporarily moved right next door to PJ's Market, and the student, after coming into the market and meeting Cheryl, they had immediately taken a liking to her, and so it became kind of like her routine to come into the market basically every night and just sit down and chat with Cheryl, sometimes for hours. The student would talk about their day at school, they'd talk about their personal life, they'd tell Cheryl all of their problems and secrets. I mean, Cheryl really became this student's confidant. And believe it or not, this was an effect that Cheryl had on lots of people. Cheryl was incredibly kind, she was empathetic, she was a great listener, she never acted like she was judging you, and she never gossiped about people. And also Cheryl had a very disarming sense of humor. It was very goofy, she was always cracking up at jokes that she had made, and so people just felt at ease around Cheryl. And they typically left interactions with her in a good mood. And on this night, when the student had come into the market, they had told Cheryl that they actually had found an apartment in Port Orchard that they were going to be moving to, so they were going to be leaving PJ's where they were now. But the student had said that they really had no money, and so it was going to be a challenge to furnish this apartment. Heck, it was going to be a challenge just to buy groceries for this apartment. And when Cheryl heard this, she first congratulated the student, but then also said, well, hey, I'll give you some of my own furniture because I don't need it all, and that will help you furnish the apartment. And then also Cheryl had grabbed that chocolate bar off the rack and given it to the student for free as a sort of like, here's your first grocery as well. The student was totally floored by Cheryl's generosity and tried to tell her, keep your furniture and you can keep this chocolate or I'll pay for it. But Cheryl insisted. She was like, nope, tomorrow I will bring you furniture and please take this candy bar. And so the student finally relented and thanked Cheryl profusely. And really, this behavior was so typical of Cheryl. She was a single mom raising a 9-year-old girl and a baby boy, and so she worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. On the weekends, she worked at PJ's Market, and then during the week, she worked at a Ford car dealership. But despite being totally swamped basically all the time providing for her family, any spare time Cheryl had, she tried to give it to other people. Whether that was helping a coworker with their resume or baking some goodies for a sick friend at church, Cheryl was all about helping other people. The area of Port Orchard where Cheryl lived was only about an hour away from the big city of Seattle, but to Cheryl, this part of Port Orchard felt much farther away than that. She lived in this tiny little blue single-story house that was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by all these tall trees. The road to her house was very rural and winding, and so where she lived felt very isolated. It was a beautiful area, no doubt, but it was also kind of a bad neighborhood. In fact, a man had been shot and killed not far from Cheryl's house just a year earlier. But this home was all she could afford. Basically, Cheryl was poor and had almost nothing of her own. But whatever she did have, she was far more likely to give away than keep for herself. Eventually, Cheryl would tell the college student that she really needed to get back to the other customers and kind of do her job and not just sit here and chat this whole time. And so the student said, thank you again for the candy and for the offer of the free furniture. And then the student left the store, at which point Cheryl reached into her pocket and grabbed some change and dumped it in the register to pay for the candy bar. Even though Cheryl knew she very likely could have gotten away with simply giving out the candy and not paying for it, Cheryl was unfailingly honest, and so she knew she wanted to pay for the candy. Cheryl would man the register until 11 p.m. that night, chatting with many more regulars who came in and out, and then at 11 p.m., Cheryl locked the front door, and then she checked the register to make sure it was all balanced and all the cash was in there, and then by 11:15, she was calling her boss to report that her shift had gone fine and that she was taking off for the night. After Cheryl had left and locked the store behind her, she made her way out to her beat-up silver sedan car that was parked outside, and then she began the drive back home, knowing that she'd be right back to PJ's the very next morning, right when it opened at 7 a.m. At the same time that Cheryl was wrapping up for the night and making her way home, her ex-husband, Roland Pitre, who lived on the other side of town, was very excited. This was the night that Roland was going to win back Cheryl. Roland glanced at his watch and saw it was just past 11 p.m., and so it was almost time. He imagined how happy Cheryl would be when he unveiled his big surprise. She would run to him and he would hold her and tell her how much he loved her and how he had always loved her. Roland hadn't yet figured out how he was going to explain his big plan to win win back his ex to his current girlfriend, but he figured he would just work that out later. The most important thing for Roland right now was showing Cheryl how wrong and stupid he had been, and how much he needed her, and how much she needed him. Also, he knew their kids would be totally thrilled if they got back together. Roland was looking after their son and daughter that weekend, and he had seen firsthand that his daughter was clearly very upset about the fact that her parents were split up. Roland and Cheryl had a very complicated history, but Roland knew, really, their breakup was his fault. They had met about 12 years earlier when Roland had been on leave from the military. At the time, Roland was a Marine sergeant, and he was also a very accomplished judo instructor. He was handsome and charismatic, and he had a charming Creole accent because he had grown up in a Cajun French family near New Orleans. But despite how appealing Roland looked, he actually was kind of a terrible romantic partner. Every woman he had ever been with, he had cheated on and then made up elaborate lies to cover it up. But regardless, Cheryl had fallen head over heels in love with Roland. And part of the reason that happened was because Cheryl was actually pretty insecure. She had long auburn hair and beautiful blue eyes and this amazing personality. But to Cheryl, she felt like she was kind of plain looking, and she also felt like she was kind of chubby, and she got the sense that men kind of did not find her all that attractive. And when she met Roland, she saw right away that the other women he had been with were these overtly glamorous and beautiful women. And so when she noticed Roland taking an interest in her, I mean, it was incredible. She felt so lucky. And so Roland and Cheryl had gotten married, they'd had their daughter together, and then basically right away, Roland had begun cheating on Cheryl. They ended up getting divorced 8 years earlier in 1980, and it was right around this point that Roland really just totally blew his life up. The woman Roland was cheating on Cheryl with was also married, and so Roland came up with this plot to murder this woman's husband. And the husband would get murdered, but when Roland was on trial, the prosecutors couldn't really untangle what his actual role was in the murder. It was not clear if he really was the guy who did the killing, or if he simply had kind of come up with the idea and other people had done it. And so ultimately, Roland was found guilty for his role in this murder, but he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. And strangely enough, it was actually during this time that Roland was in jail that he and Cheryl kind of came back to each other. While Roland was behind bars, he had this epiphany that Cheryl was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he totally screwed it up. And so he began writing her letters, telling her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for being unfaithful. And also he began explaining that, the charges he was found guilty of in connection to this murder were totally not true, that he had been screwed. And Cheryl had eventually begun writing back to Roland, telling him that she still loved him too. And they actually would get remarried while Roland was in prison. And then when he got out of prison, he moved in with Cheryl and their daughter in Port Orchard, and they would have another baby together, their son, and then also Roland enrolled in nursing school. And so for a time, this family was back together and everything was great. But eventually, Roland went back to his old ways and began cheating on Cheryl again, and before long, the couple had separated again and began living separately. And so fast forward back to the night of October 15th, 1988, and Roland is anxiously waiting to begin this big plan to win Cheryl back, and he glances at his watch and he sees it's now 11:30 p.m., which means it's go time. And so Roland, he stands up really quickly and begins walking towards the front door of his house when suddenly he feels so lightheaded that he actually falls back on the couch and passes out cold. Roland had serious blood pressure issues, and sometimes if he stood up too quickly, it would make him feel really dizzy and he would faint. And so that's what happened. And then at some point after he fainted, Roland kind of came to, but he was in such a fog mentally that instead of, going out and doing this big plan to win Cheryl back, he just kind of wandered his way upstairs and climbed in bed with his girlfriend and fell asleep for the rest of the night. Cheryl was due back at PJ's Market the next morning at 7 a.m. She was going to open the store and also drop off that furniture with the college student. But when the first customers, including that college student, arrived at PJ's Market, they saw the door was locked and the lights were off inside. Now, all of these customers knew Cheryl really well, and they really liked her, and they knew she should have been there by that point. This was totally uncharacteristic of Cheryl to not be there on time, and so it wasn't long before these patrons began calling Cheryl at her home. But Cheryl never picked up. However, remember, this is 1988, so people didn't have cell phones, they used landlines, and so it was totally normal to periodically call someone and not have them pick up. It just meant they weren't home. Now, at first, people in Port Orchard just kind of assumed that, there must be a rational explanation for why Cheryl is not at work. Maybe there was a family emergency, maybe her car didn't start, but there had to be some sort of reasonable reason for her absence. That night, Cheryl didn't show up at Roland and his girlfriend's house to collect her daughter and son. Now, Roland didn't know that Cheryl had missed work all day that day, and so he assumed Cheryl must just be running late. But by 6:30 p.m. that night, when still Cheryl had not arrived and she hadn't called, Roland finally called Cheryl, but she didn't answer, and so Roland just left Cheryl this very upbeat message on her answering machine and then waited for her to call back. But despite how cheerful this message was that Roland left, it kind of betrayed the way he actually felt. Roland was not happy. That morning, when he had woken up and realized he had slept through the night and not done the big plan to win Cheryl back, he felt so stupid. He had this chance to win her back, and he blew it. But over the next couple of hours, when Cheryl did not return Roland's call, he went from being solely worried about, how he blew this opportunity to win his ex-wife back, to now just being concerned about his ex-wife. Where is she? What's going on? And so late that night, Roland would actually call the police and report Cheryl missing. A deputy came out to Roland's house to take down this report, and then Roland actually gave the deputy a spare key to Cheryl's place, and then this deputy went to Cheryl's house. It was totally quiet. He knocked. There was no answer. He let himself inside using this spare key, and he found the home was totally in order. There was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. The deputy eventually walked over to Cheryl's answering machine, and he saw there was a blinking light, which meant there were messages that had not been played yet. And so he hit play, and the first message was from Cheryl's daughter, who was calling to say goodnight and I love you. And then there were several messages from customers from PJ's Market that were calling to ask, why Cheryl was not at work and was she okay. There was a message from Cheryl's boss also asking, what's going on? Why aren't you at work? And then there was that message from Roland, who had called when she had not come to pick up the kids. And then the last message on the machine played, and when the deputy heard it, he knew something was terribly wrong. The last message was from a stranger who was calling Cheryl to be like, hey, I found your purse floating in Lake Union, which is near Seattle. And the stranger was like, I don't know if your purse was stolen and dumped here, or if you were here and you left it in the water or something, but I'd love to give the purse back to you. And the stranger left a phone number for Cheryl to call so she could come and pick up her purse. Lake Union was only about an hour away from Port Orchard, where Cheryl lived, but there was just no real reason she would ever be around Lake Union. She never went on trips. She didn't have the time or money to, even for short ones, like going to Lake Union an hour away. And then also, Cheryl's entire life was in Port Orchard, and her life was her kids, her jobs, and the church. And so there was just no logical explanation for why Cheryl's purse would be in Lake Union. But regardless, detectives from Port Orchard, along with police from Seattle, linked up and went out to Lake Union and began looking for Cheryl's car, because maybe she did go out here, maybe she did lose her purse in the water, and maybe she's still here. But Lake Union is a very busy place with lots of people and businesses living right along the water's edge, and even more people living right on the water in houseboats. And so there were literally thousands and thousands of cars all over Lake Union, so trying to find Cheryl's nondescript silver sedan took some time. But on the night of October 19th, so 3 days after Cheryl had failed to show up at PJ's Market for that 7 a.m. opening, police would find her car near Lake Union. And at first, it seemed like, Cheryl must have just driven here and abandoned the car for some reason, because there was no sign of a struggle inside or outside of the car. There was nothing strange about this car. It was just parked in a lot. But when authorities went around to the back of the car and used a screwdriver to pop open the trunk, they realized right away that that could not have been what happened, because Cheryl was in the trunk. and she was deceased and very clearly had been beaten to death. The investigation into Cheryl's murder would take more than a decade. The police started with Roland because 1, he was Cheryl's ex-husband, and 2, because Roland had previously been convicted for his role in a murder, even though the details of exactly what he did were never really clear. But Roland had an alibi that was airtight. He had witnesses that could confirm he was nowhere near Lake Union or Cheryl on the night that she was killed. And Roland was very cooperative with police after finding out what happened to his ex-wife. I mean, he was really bent out of shape. And so Roland very quickly signed paperwork to allow detectives to come into his home and search it and search all of his things. And he also began regularly contacting the police to offer up any information he could think of that could be useful, including an odd story he told about this young man that was following Cheryl around in the few days before she died. He didn't know much about it, but he knew there was something odd happening with this young man. Now, Roland didn't really have much more information than this suggestion that somebody was following her around, and so police were never really able to fully follow up on that lead. But police did interview virtually everybody in Cheryl's life, from her friends to her family to her co-workers at the Ford dealership and PJ's Market. They talked to people at church who knew her, and nobody really popped up as being very suspicious. Basically, everyone said, look, Cheryl was this incredible person who everybody seemed to love. It makes no sense that somebody would want to harm her. But a year after Cheryl's death, the police would get their first big break in this case. A newspaper journalist contacted the police to let them know that this random young man had contacted him and confessed to killing Cheryl and then hung up without giving his name or his location or how to get in touch with him again. It was almost like this person had called just to get this huge secret off their chest somewhat anonymously. The police convinced the journalist to actually write a story about this strange call he got to see if maybe they could flush out this young man who had just confessed. And when this article ran in the newspaper, one of Cheryl's old co-workers from the car dealership called the police to be like, hey, there was this young man who worked at this dealership with us and with Cheryl who was totally creepy and definitely had a thing for Cheryl. The co-worker said this guy's name was Albie Brotsweller and that he worked in the garage and he was known as a kind of odd guy with a short temper who totally creeped out all the women who worked at the dealership. And this co-worker would tell police that before Cheryl died, she had been working with Albie on his resume. And while they had been working together, Albie had developed this weird fixation on Cheryl. And when police began looking into Albie, they discovered he had quit his job at the dealership a day before Cheryl went missing, and then a couple of days after he had quit, so by this point Cheryl has been found murdered, one of Cheryl's colleagues said they saw Albie, and he had this really deep cut on his hand that he kept wrapped in a big bandage. Detectives would also discover that Albie's father lived right near PJ's Market, and Albie's mother lived right near the area where Cheryl's car had been found, out near Lake Union. And so suddenly, Roland's previously odd-seeming story about some random young man following Cheryl around before she was murdered made a lot of sense. It seemed like Albie was this strange young man Roland was talking about. When detectives tracked Albie down, he was sullen and totally uncooperative. But eventually the police got him to talk, and he would tell them that he had cut his hand fishing. And so police rounded up all these people Albie said he had been fishing with when he cut his hand, and in separate interviews, all of those people confirmed that Albie was telling the truth. And also police knew that even though circumstantially Albie looked really suspicious, there was not a single shred of actual evidence that tied him to Cheryl's death. And so pretty quickly, Albie was let go, and the police at that point kind of hit a dead end in this case. And in fact, the case went totally cold at this point. And then, one day in 2002, so 14 years after Cheryl was murdered, a man in prison got word out to police that he actually knew exactly who killed Cheryl. He said the murderer's name was Frederick J. McKee, and that he was currently incarcerated for cooking meth. Now, we don't know exactly how this inmate knew Frederick was the killer, But this inmate who called police was cellmates with Frederick McKee, and so very likely he overheard Frederick say something incriminating, and so this inmate called the police. And so police got a DNA sample from McKee, and they compared his sample to the skin cells that were found on the duct tape that had been used to bind Cheryl's hands when she was killed, and unbelievably, it was a match. Frederick was the killer. But as police dug deeper, they quickly realized that, Frederick's heinous actions of actually killing Cheryl was not the worst part of the story. The story of what really happened to Cheryl Petre was so insanely nonsensical that right away newspapers all over the country began to cover it. It was converted into a true crime documentary, and even a famous author wrote a book about it. I mean, this story really was just totally sensational. First, I'm going to give you the facts of what happened to Cheryl. And then I'm going to give you the absurd and tragic explanation for why these things happened to Cheryl. Late on the night of October 15th, 1988, so the night that Cheryl disappeared, the meth cook, Frederick J. McKee, ambushed Cheryl as she came home from PJ's Market. We don't know exactly where the ambush happened, but we think it happened right outside of Cheryl's home. And after he ambushed her, he forced her into her own trunk, he bound her hands, and then began savagely beating her. Now, based on her injuries, Cheryl obviously put up a big fight, kicking and punching and trying her best to get out of the trunk, but eventually Frederick had taken the actual metal of the trunk and began slamming it down on Cheryl's face, and that allowed him to overpower her and eventually beat her to death. And then after she was dead, he shut the trunk with Cheryl inside of her car, and then he drove her car all the way out to Lake Union, and then he abandoned the car with Cheryl still inside of it and chucked her purse into the water. But this terrible night was not supposed to go this way. Here's what was going on in the background. At the same time that Cheryl was closing up shop at PJ's Market and beginning her trip back home, her ex-husband, Roland, on the other side of town, was sitting in his house anxiously checking his watch, waiting for the right time to launch this big plan that was going to win Cheryl back. Roland's big plan was that he was going to save Cheryl's life. He had hired his buddy, Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, who he had met in prison, and he had given Frederick a spare key to Cheryl's house.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast, I could roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past. And the pettiness, a reflection of the emptiness. Hilarious, you think you're worth my time, you're delirious. Mysterious, because you hide behind a fake exterior. Inferior, you know I'll always be a bit superior. Get off of me, this ain't no humble brag. I want you to hear words, you can say them back. I want you to feel free from the chains at last, and to believe in what you got, it was built to last, yeah.
Now that I've been put through hell, I never got anyone's help. I had to do it all myself.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Gonna learn the consequence of being incompetent. Mental health is confidence, dreams and some honestness. I'm not here to save the day, that's for you to take away. I could play a million mind games, but instead I say something not illogical, something that is topical. Rub it on and watch it go, make yourself unstoppable. Dreams are irresponsible, but they're always possible. If you just believe, you could be
so remarkable. Thoughts in my head, a collage and they spread. I'll be great one day, going off of my meds. No, I'm not giving up, no, I'm not giving in. I will make it to the top, taking off in the wind. I gotta make it, I'm saving every day to taste it. I'm patient, but my mind, it can hardly take it. I'm chasing a dream that I've had for several ages. A vacant, modern kingdom for the taking. Now that I've been put through hell, I never got anyone's help. I had to do it all myself. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
So excited to go do this thing that he had one of his low blood pressure episodes and he fainted. And then when he came to a little while later, instead of going out the door to really at this point stopping this abduction from happening, Roland just kind of trudged upstairs and went to sleep. And this was a really big problem because Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, he was hired to actually abduct Cheryl. He was not aware that this was actually a setup for Roland to come in and save the day. McKee literally believed Roland wanted him to abduct his wife, and he didn't ask any questions. He just said, okay, I'll do that. And then when Roland didn't show up, Frederick went through with the actual abduction of Cheryl, and during this abduction, things got out of hand, and Frederick wound up beating Cheryl to death. Both Roland and McKee would be convicted for the murder of Cheryl Petrie. And by the time the cops had finally solved this cold case, Roland was actually already in prison for attempting to kidnap the son of another ex-wife in an effort to impress this ex-wife. It had not worked. Roland was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was on top of the 25 years he was already serving, and McKee would get 20 years. Once the news headlines fade about whatever terrible thing happened to them, the victims of violent crime and their families are often left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives all on their own. This is why we started the MrBallen Foundation. It is a registered 501c3 charity whose sole purpose is to help these forgotten people. However, we can't do it alone. Since last year, with your help, we were able to raise and give away to victims of violent crime and their families over $500,000. And this year alone, our studio, Ballen Studios, is going to donate $1 million. And to be clear, the MrBallen Foundation does not make a profit. Zero. Meaning 100% of your donations to the foundation go to the cause. Not to overhead, not to salaries, nothing. It's just the cause. So if you're looking for a highly transparent, very active charity that is just trying to do the thing we say we do to support victims of violent crime and their families, then look no further than the MrBallen Foundation. To make a donation, simply go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Again, that's MrBallen.Foundation and click Donate. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on the podcast, so you can't get them on YouTube. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.